Good evening and welcome to today's special edition of Bharat News. Tonight, we have an exclusive and highly insightful discussion on global politics, US strategy, and the shifting power dynamics in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. And who better to give us the unfiltered truth than our esteemed guest, former US National Security Advisor and former US Ambassador to the UN, John Bolton. Stay tuned as we dive deep into US policies, the upcoming elections, and what all this means to India and the world. Let's welcome John Bolton to the show. Good morning, sir. Thank you for being here. With your vast experience, especially as a former National Security Advisor and US Ambassador to the UN, can you give us a brief overview of the current global conflicts, particularly focusing on the Russia-Ukraine war and the tensions between Israel and Iran?
Well, I think the most important thing that's happening in the world today is the building of a China-Russia axis, in part because of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, in part because of what's happening in the Middle East, and in part because of China's hegemonic aspirations along the Indo-Pacific periphery. I'm not saying the Beijing-Moscow axis is fully perfected, because it's not, but it's continuing to grow. And so I think there's a growing relationship between how the world responds in Ukraine, how it responds in the Middle East, and how it responds in Asia. The threat, the particular threat posed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, its second invasion since 2014, is that this is an act of unprovoked aggression. And it really is designed, as Vladimir Putin warned the world back in 2005 and 2007. It's part of a Russian effort to recreate the Russian Empire. And if the signal that we send everywhere in the world is that we're not going to resist this unprovoked aggression, it will tell others in China and elsewhere that the possibilities for them doing exactly the same thing are real. The Middle East is another example. This is what is happening today is what the Iranians call the Ring of Fire strategy against Israel. It's not a series of separate conflicts. It's proxy war by Iran through terrorist groups. But really, with Russia and China implicitly and explicitly supporting Iran. China is a major purchaser of Iranian oil, and Russia because of Iranian support for Russia's efforts in the war against Ukraine. So all of this is still in formation. Things are still moving, but these are examples of cooperation among countries that certainly don't have the best interest of the U.S. at heart, or of many of our friends and allies.
That was a very vast description, sir. So talking about the Iran's nuclear program, we have seen that the Biden-Harris administration has been working on reviving the Iran nuclear deal. Do you think this is a sustainable approach to contain Iran's ambitions, or should the US pursue more aggressive strategies, especially considering the strategic importance of waterways like the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf?
Well, look, I think the Biden administration is trying to do what the Obama administration did under the theory that Iran can be talked out of its pursuit of nuclear weapons. But the fact is, there has never been any evidence that Iran has made a strategic decision to give up the pursuit of nuclear weapons. And I think continuing to try and chase that has just made the situation more dangerous. The 2015 nuclear deal was flawed from the beginning. Iran never should have been given permission to enrich uranium. Everybody's known for decades that its focus wasn't on civil nuclear power. It was on getting deliverable nuclear weapons. And I think the Gulf Arab states fully understand that Iran is the threat to peace and security in the Middle East. I think the Arab interests are much more closely aligned with Israel than at this point they are with the Biden administration. And I think the fact that the White House has allowed the Houthis in Yemen to close the Suez Canal, Red Sea passage is a terrible mistake. It's not just relating to the war against Israel. It's related to a principle of American national security that goes back to before we were a country, when we were 13
Right.
little colonies. Freedom of the seas is critical, and the Houthis have closed international waterways by closing the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. That impedes trade from Europe to Asia. It impedes world commerce generally, and it's something we shouldn't allow. I think right now we're seeing whether Israel, in response to the latest Iranian ballistic missile attack, will choose to retaliate against Iran and may decide, we don't know, may decide to go after the Iranian nuclear weapons program. I think they're perfectly entitled to do that. That would be the choice I would make. And I think the United States should help them. It's a proliferation threat for the whole world.
So now talking about the Russia-Ukraine war, the US has provided substantial military and economic support to Ukraine in its defense against Russia. How do you evaluate the current US government handling the situation? Could the US have done more early on to deter Russian aggression?
Well, yes. I mean, I think the White House did not do enough in 2021 and early 2022 to deter the Russians. I think deterrence was possible. I think had there been more weapon shipments, had the administration corrected the mistake the United States and Europe made in 2014, when the cost to Russia of the first invasion was really minimal. Had we shown that we were determined to correct that mistake and would have been prepared for even stronger measures before a second invasion, deterrence might have worked. We don't know. It wasn't tried. We know that what was tried failed. We also know that through the last 2.5 years, the Biden administration has been more focused on preventing a Ukrainian defeat than on helping to assure a Ukrainian win. So while we failed to deter the Russians before the war, during the war, the Russians have deterred the US and NATO by this constant fear of a wider war, the nuclear saber rattling, both of which were bluffs. I'm not saying you don't take this sort of thing seriously, but the history has been that there's nothing behind these Russian threats. Nonetheless, the supply of assistance, which has been very substantial and appropriately so, has not been done in a strategic fashion. We have doled out these weapon systems after long public disputes about whether to do it. And then by the time we do it, we make a decision on Abrams tanks. We make a decision on ATACMS missiles. We make a decision on F-16s. By that time, there's a new need, and then we'll have a long debate about that. So by not providing, and this is a criticism of the U.S. and NATO as a whole, by not providing the assistance in a coherent strategic fashion, I'm afraid we've contributed to the gridlock that we now see militarily, territorially, and the destruction inside Ukraine, which has been quite extensive.
Sir, as you mentioned NATO, given the strain the Russia-Ukraine war has placed on NATO, do you think the alliance is still strong enough to counter future threats from Russia or even China? Could this conflict eventually weaken NATO, especially if the war drags on?
Well, I think the NATO alliance in many respects has been strengthened. Certainly Finland and Sweden, having broken with 75 years of neutrality post-World War II, joining NATO is a sign they understand the only real defense against Russia is behind a NATO border. I think the bigger problem is what may happen if Donald Trump is elected. He has repeatedly threatened to get out of NATO, and I had some experience with it during my time in the White House. Yeah. I'm very afraid he would get out of NATO. I believe that would be a catastrophic mistake for the U.S. It would be effectively the end of NATO, and our adversaries around the world would see it as a general retreat of the resurgence of American isolationism, which I think would be dangerous worldwide.
So, sir, looking at the current geopolitical situation, particularly in the Middle East, Europe, and South Asia, which leadership do you believe would be more favorable for U.S. interest? Is it Donald Trump or Kamala Harris?
Well, I don't think either one of them really are fit to be president, and it's not a happy moment for the United States. Obviously, one of them will win the election in November, but for different reasons, I don't think they're up to the task. Trump is very erratic. He's transactional, idiosyncratic. He doesn't have a philosophy. He doesn't pursue policy as we understand that term. And I think the record of his first administration shows that. Harris has had very little national security experience in her career. Whatever she's learned sitting through 3.5+ years of National Security Council meetings under President Biden. You know, the best prediction that anybody can make about what she will do, at least for the first year and a half, is that it will look a lot like the Biden administration. I think that policy is badly mistaken with respect to China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, you name it. So I'm not looking forward to the outcome of this election. I'm not myself going to vote for either one of them. I'll write in the name of a conservative Republican, but it'll be a difficult 4 years. And I think there'll be intense debate in the United States about what our policy should be because of basically weak leadership in the White House.
Sir, you have been the US ambassador to the UN, and you have been very critical of the UN in the past. Given our experience as US ambassador, how do you assess the UN and the International Court of Justice ability to address the Israel-Iran conflict and the Russia-Ukraine war? Are these institutions effective, or do they need reform to better handle such significant geopolitical issues?
You know, the United Nations is a huge, sprawling organization. That's one of its problems. Many of its specialized agencies, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the International Maritime Organization, do good work when they're not politicized. But what's fundamentally broken about the UN are its political decision-making bodies. The Security Council, the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council don't function. And they won't function in the current crises. Obviously, in the Ukraine war, Russia would veto anything that might be suggested as a way to end the conflict. And in the Middle East, I think Russia and China would have Iran's back and veto anything that might be proposed there. So I don't see this changing. There have been many arguments for UN reform, modifying the Security Council to have more permanent members. That subject first came up during the Nixon administration when Japan said they wanted to become a permanent member. Yeah. That was over 50 years ago. And as everybody can see, no change has been made. That shows how difficult it is. The world today, 50 years later, looks less like the world in 1945 than it did even back in 1970, and still nothing has changed. So I'm not optimistic that the UN can fix itself.
So now talking about China, with China becoming increasingly assertive in the South China Sea, establishing deeper ties with both Israel and Iran, and supporting Russia economically and strategically, how should the US recalibrate its foreign policy? Is the US prepared to face both Russia and China as strategic adversaries, or is it time to prioritize one over the other?
Well, I think from the U.S. perspective, the most significant thing China is doing is building up its nuclear weapons arsenal, with every indication that in a relatively short period of time, 5 to 10 years, that's a short period of time in the nuclear world, China may well have deliverable nuclear weapon arsenals equal to that of Russia and the United States. And that represents a fundamental change from the Cold War, which was a bipolar nuclear standoff, to a tripolar nuclear world. And everything that the US did during the Cold War was based on a bipolar environment. So our weapons levels, the development of the nuclear triad, land-based, sea-based, and air-based weapons, all that we know about deterrence theory to avoid the nuclear conflict to begin with, all of that is based on the US versus the Soviet Union. When you put a third country in at a roughly a peer level to those two, all of that thinking and preparation goes out the window. It's like saying you have 3 people playing chess instead of 2. It's a completely different game at that point. But the Chinese threat is broader than that as well. It really is economic and political globally, but particularly along its periphery. We see the threat in the East China Sea against Taiwan and the Senkaku Islands that Japan sees as its territory. We see it in the South China Sea, where the Chinese have purported to annex 80% of the surface area of the South China Sea, and we see it along its various land borders in Asia, from Vietnam to India. I think what is really required is thinking by everybody who's affected how to deal with this increasing aspiration by China to be hegemonic in its local area, but ultimately worldwide. And I think things like the Asian Security Quad, Japan, India, Australia, and the United States, I think that's an important step. I think the AUKUS relationship between Australia, the US, and the UK to build nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. I think the recent agreement by South Korea and Japan to have trilateral military maneuvers with the United States, very significant step there. So there's a lot to talk about, because I think the Chinese threat will only grow over the next several years.
Sir, how do you see Prime Minister Narendra Modi's role as a negotiator in these ongoing conflicts?
Well, I think India, as a major player in the 21st century, is going to be critical to how a lot of these issues turn out. I think Prime Minister Modi has shown he's a international leader. He's been a force in many international affairs, and I think that whether the Asian Security Quad is going to turn into something more than simply a discussion group about problems in the region will depend on the direction India wants to take. I think India has some very hard decisions ahead of it. It's obviously had a long relationship with Russia during the Cold War. A lot of military technology is embedded into the Indian military. Of course, Russia is now selling that same technology to China, which is a principal threat to India. So whether continued reliance on Russia makes strategic sense, I think, is an issue that's going to have to be debated. India obviously was non-aligned during the Cold War. And in the U.S., there's a story that your listeners may not know about, but at one point, a senior Indian official was speaking with Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who, of course, had been American ambassador to India at one point. And it was after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Moynihan said to somebody he had known for a long time, a friend of his from India, in fact, not just a senior official, he said, "What are you non-aligned about anymore?" And look, it's a serious discussion, but I do think a lot's going to depend on how India turns out. And I think Modi is a central figure, obviously, in precisely that area.
Sir, as you clearly mentioned, the China the biggest threat, and as you right now said that Modi, everyone is looking at Prime Minister Modi. Recently, sir, US there was a deal for the transfer of technology of jet engines. US only agreed to transfer 75 to 80% of the technology, whereas France, on the other end, was willing to transfer 100% of the technology. Sir, how do you assess this situation, particularly among these global conflicts and geopolitically?
Well, when it comes to technology transfer, particularly in the national security area, there are a lot of restrictions on American exports, a lot of restrictions on licensing that technology. In the nuclear sphere, it's still mostly American technology that goes into nuclear reactor construction, which is why it was a mistake to allow Iran, for example, to continue to enrich uranium under the 2015 nuclear deal, when we won't even license that technology to our friends in the Arab world without them committing that they won't enrich uranium. And they said to us, well, how can you allow Iran to enrich uranium when you won't allow your friends to do it? So these are complicated questions, and I think it's a matter, this having come under my purview when I worked in the George W. Bush State Department before I went to the UN, this question of licensing and the balancing of what technology is restricted, what technology we're prepared to share, has to be under constant evaluation. And there are, I can tell you, one concern that continues to linger, and that is this longstanding reliance by India on Russian technology. For example, the S-400, the Russian S-400 anti-aircraft defense system, which makes it very difficult for us to share F-35 technology, stealth technology with countries that have the S-400. So I'm not minimizing the difficulty of India's decision here, but it seems to me, there's as the saying goes in the United States, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. One way or the other, a decision is going to have to be made at some point, I think relatively soon.
So last question for today. Can India fully trust the US as a reliable ally, especially in the event of a potential conflict with China?
Well, I think the answer to that in part depends on American politics, and as the two largest democracies in the world, I think India and the United States both recognize that when you change governments, you often get changes in policy. Look, it's the development of mutual trust doesn't happen overnight. I think relations between the U.S. and India have been improving at a fairly steady rate for 25 years now. I think the U.S. is now well past the point when, as we saw often during the Cold War, it was either tilting toward Pakistan or tilting toward India. We've got. I think we've moved past that. And my own personal view is I think relations between the U.S. and India have to improve and deepen, and that requires a lot of intense conversations, very difficult issues to confront, hopefully done in private on both sides, so we're not reading about it in the newspaper. But I think India's stake ultimately is together with the U.S. and the broader world that's worried about Chinese Russian aggression. And
Yes.
it takes time to change things that have been a pattern in the past. I understand that. I do think it's worth it, and I think for all of us, whether we're in government or not in government, discussions between U.S. and India remain probably the highest diplomatic priority for the U.S. in the foreseeable future.
Definitely, sir. Sir, just one last question. As you clearly state that neither Donald Trump nor Kamala Harris is good for US, but who do you think is Donald Trump or Kamala Harris good for India? Who will be good for India, sir?
I think it's just a very hard prediction to make. As I say, my guess would be that Kamala Harris foreign policy with respect to India and more broadly will look a lot like the Biden policy. And I think I give Biden credit for taking the Quad a few steps down the road. I think that's been important. I think a lot more could be done. With Trump, he has a good personal relationship with Modi. And it may well be if policy under Trump toward China stiffens that there are chances there as well. But I will tell you, and get ready for it now, that for Trump, the India-U.S. trade relationship will be at the top of the agenda, with a lot of complaints about Indian restrictions on American imports. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of complaints from the Indian side about American restrictions and so on. Trade is always a difficult issue, even among friends. And I think for Trump, it's always the top issue.
Definitely. He is a businessman, though.
Well, hopefully that's what negotiations are for, and trade negotiations are difficult even among friends. But if you go through it, hopefully you get to a new level.
Definitely, sir. Sir, thank you for your time. We really learned a lot from you, and hope to see you again on Bharat News.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.